All right, everybody, we're going to get started. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sara Kuebbing. Sara did her undergraduate at University of Delaware. You'll correct me if I get any of this wrong. Her PhD at University of Tennessee in ecology and evolutionary biology. And then we were lucky enough to have her here actually as a postdoc working with Mark Bradford, first as a YSE fellow and then as a Smith Conservation Fellow. She then left us, went off, started a faculty position at University of Pittsburgh, and then we were lucky enough to lure her back here to be the inaugural director of research for the Yale Applied Science Synthesis Program, which she's going to tell us about at the beginning of her talk. But I have to say, it is so amazing to have Sara here at Yale. If you haven't met her yet, you should. She is extremely knowledgeable. She has a background studying invasive species, invasion biology, as well as conservation biology. And now she is applying her expertise to thinking about forest management, forest carbon, but just more generally about how science can inform management and conservation. So she's a real asset to the school, and we're very lucky to have her. I don't want you to get too inundated, but people should be inundating her with requests for her expertise and her knowledge, because she's really great to have here. So I don't want to take more of her time, but she's going to talk to us today about managing forests and other ecosystems in a changing world. Thanks.
Thank you, Liza. Is this on? Can folks hear me? Awesome. See some nods. Yes. So I'm going to start this talk by just saying I decided to change my talk well after Joan asked me to give a talk title. So surprise, I'm not just going to talk about forests today. So anyone here who's interested about agriculture and soils will be in for a treat in the latter half. Liza, thank you so much for the introduction. I will just say you should also bother Liza because she's a wonderful mentor. And it is my pleasure to be back here working with Liza and Mark and other folks here at YSE and YC NCC. So I'm really happy to be here today to share a little bit about this new group that maybe some of you know, but maybe some of you do not know, called the Yale Applied Science Synthesis Program. And we are an initiative that's funded through the Yale Center for Natural Carbon Capture, which is a center that promotes scientific research for natural solutions to mitigate climate change. We also collaborate a lot with all the great students and faculty at the Forest School here at the Yale School of the Environment. And like Liza said, I joined YCNCC and YSE as a research scientist just a little over 2 years ago. I would love for you all to come bug me, but you do have to walk up Prospect Hill to Marsh Hall where our offices are. So that will be the litmus test of how interested you are to come talk to me in the future. There we go. And so I totally recognize that our name, Yale Applied Science Synthesis Program, is a huge mouthful. And I will say it's also taken many of our most ardent supporters here at YSE and YCNCC over a year to even learn how to pronounce our name. To shorten, we also call ourselves YASP, which I know is only slightly better than the name itself, but it just feels like a Yale tradition to have sort of a long and cumbersome acronym. And you can all just be thankful that we do have a vowel in our acronym. So I wanted to do my best to take the first 5 minutes of this talk to explain a little bit about why we picked these specific words for our name and to introduce the research program writ large. And so the first question that you might have is, well, what does YASP do? And you can read a lot of words here, synthesis.yale.edu, to learn about a lot of the specifics we're doing. But to distill it down to 5 words, we try to help people make decisions. And more specifically, we want to help people make decisions about how they manage ecosystems like forests, agroecosystems, wetlands, grasslands, so that these ecosystems can continue to provide the important services that humans value. And these services range from protecting biodiversity, to providing food, fiber, and fuel, to cleaning our air and our water, to providing a spiritual respite and recreation and cultural identity. And as I'm going to talk about a lot later on in my talk, capturing and storing carbon. So the next question you might have is, well, how do we know what decisions people need to make about these ecosystems? And we use this very, very sophisticated approach at YASP. We ask them. And this is why we say we do applied science, because the projects that we work on and the questions that we answer, we really hope will be applied by the people who ask us these questions. And so far, I've been here for about 2 years, and I found that people are very willing to tell me what questions that they need answered and what decisions that they need to make. And in fact, so much so that after 2 years, I have an entire career's worth of questions and things that I need to answer. But here are just some of the partners that we have asked, that have asked us for help to applying science to their decisions. These include agricultural groups like Ocean Spray Cranberries. These are folks who manage wetlands and forests and grasslands all across North America. General Mills that is growing grain and feeding lots of folks, not just here in the United States, but also around the world. It includes environmental nonprofits like the Environmental Defense Fund, who work to create environmental solutions to make a lasting difference in the world. And it includes national labs and federal agencies like the Department of Energy that need to decide how to scale carbon removal technology to address climate warming. And so specifically, how do we answer these questions? And I'll say we do it in 2 ways. And the first important way is, well, with all of the great people here, all of you. We have a really great team of students and postdocs and faculty here at YSE and affiliated with YC NCC that are collaborating on various projects with us. And this is a really crucial element to our work because remember, I told you that we source our projects from people who need to make decisions. And rarely are these decisions just about the ecology of the ecosystems. So as Liza mentioned, I come here as a plant ecologist and an invasion biologist. I'd be really happy to nerd out with folks in forests, teaching them to identify plants or talk about plant soil feedbacks or identify forest health issues. But I don't have all the expertise that I need to help people make decisions about land stewardship and management. And we really do need an interdisciplinary team of people who know things like business and money and finance and economics, or people who know things about big data and stats and just philosophy, conservation philosophy and conservation ethics, industrial ecology, and so on to help make these important decisions. The second way that we help people make decisions is by using data, which is really great because we're at this awesome institution that produces lots of awesome information and data all the time. But here's the catch about trying to help people make decisions using real data. People really want to make their decisions now. They want to act quickly, and they may not be interested in waiting for many years for a researcher, especially a field scientist, to get funding and design an experiment and collect all the data and train all their postdocs and graduate students, and then finally publish that data. And so importantly, one thing that I've learned after about 15 years of conducting empirical ecological research is that collecting and analyzing and publishing this data can be quite slow. And so instead, we've decided here at YASP that we will focus on synthesizing existing data, finding those data streams that exist and using those to give the best possible answers to the questions that we need answering now. And so this is why we say we do applied science synthesis, which we hope means that we can bring the best available data forward to answer some of the most pressing questions about land management for ecosystem services. And now that I've told you a little bit about who we are and how we work, I'm going to spend the rest of the talk sharing a bit about some of the synthesis projects that we've been working on. And to do that, I first have to tell you a little bit about what many of the questions about land management that practitioners and policymakers are asking right now. And they all boil down to this sort of catchphrase jargon term of nature-based solutions. This is a term that the IUCN and the World Bank coined back in 2009, and it's taken off as a really compelling way to meet global environmental and sustainability challenges. And more specifically, people want to know about nature-based solutions for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing that carbon in plants and soils. And of course, this conversation is really acute right now because of the IPCC's latest 6th assessment report that said that we don't just need to make immediate and deep cuts to carbon dioxide emissions to keep global temperatures below our 1.5 or 2 degree threshold, but that we also need to now remove excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And specifically, they write, all pathways that limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius with limited or no overshoot project the use of carbon dioxide removal. The IPCC has also told us that natural climate solutions, in particular, improving how we manage our forests or our croplands and grasslands, are going to be a really crucial component to mitigating climate change by removing this carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So they've told us both what the problem is and also some really important solutions moving forward. And so because of this really high level engagement from nations to corporations, some of the most pressing questions that policymakers and land managers have to do with managing ecosystems for carbon dioxide removal. And what I found from talking to people is that we can kind of bin these questions into two bins. The first type of question goes along the lines of, well, what should we do? How should we improve our management of our forest or my farm or within the ecosystems in my country? What management approaches will most likely achieve our goals of carbon capture and storage? How do we adapt our management to this changing climate in these different worlds that we're going to see in the future? The second bin of questions that follow is along the lines of, well, how can we tell if what we're doing is working? If I change how I manage my ecosystems, how do I monitor the effects? If I want to invest in land management, how do I know that my investment is leading to whatever the desired results that I want to pay for? And I'll say this question in particular is underpinning most of the carbon crediting questions that have to do with natural climate solutions to date. And so we've been helping people address both types of questions here at YASP, and I'm going to tell you about two projects that we've done that sort of fall into each of these two bins. The first in this what can we do category, we were asked to lead a chapter in a national report that was commissioned by President Biden's Department of Energy to answer the question specifically of how the US can manage their forests to remove more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Clicker's not. The second question that falls into the second bin of questions of how can we tell if what we're doing is working was asked to us by the Environmental Defense Fund to answer the specific question of whether our soil carbon crediting methodology is delivering equivalent carbon credits. And so for the rest of the talk, I'm going to tell you about how we're answering these two questions. So on the first question, we have just published our full findings in a response to the DOE's question about forest management in a collaborative report called Roads to Removal. And this was published back in December, where we provided 3 potential options for forest management for carbon dioxide removal for the United States. And just remember that I said that YASP works with a big, great team of people. This is altogether true for this Roads to Removal report. And so I just want to acknowledge all the faculty and postdocs and students here at YASP who contributed to the original research that came out in this report, plus an alumni, Mark Ducey, right here, who now is faculty at the University of New Hampshire, that we're all co-authors and contributors on this report. And I want to just step back and say it's actually really not surprising at all that the DOE sort of asked this question about how do we manage these forests, because this is a super contentious question right now here in the United States, but also globally. And I'd like to say there's a lot of narratives out about this topic, and these narratives span a really huge range from sort of this pretty grim and hopeless narrative, forests are no longer our climate friends. And this narrative is arguing that because of all these climate-induced disturbances like wildfires and droughts and storms, that forests are not a climate solution that we should even be thinking about depending on. We also have this narrative that sort of exemplifies this American preservationist thought to forest management. It costs nothing to leave our trees as they are. And this narrative is arguing that the best way that we can manage our forests for climate mitigation is just to leave them alone and let them grow. Do nothing. And then we also have a narrative out there that's very conservationist, sort of American conservationist in its ethic. Let's fill our cities with taller wooden buildings. And this narrative really argues that we can protect forests, we can mitigate climate change, and we can still extract important natural resources that support people's livelihoods. And so the question is, when the DOE asks this question, how do we provide them a compelling answer that sort of cuts across all of these narratives? And I think the first really important lesson is that we have to include climate-related disturbances in our answer. We have to account for the fact that these climate-related disturbances are going to exist, and that ignoring them is going to mean that our answer is incomplete. The second lesson in our research is that recognizing that people have different values and they prioritize different services that forests provide us. They might prioritize habitat for biodiversity, or they might prioritize revenue for rural communities and essential projects. And they might see that those priorities are in conflict with one another, or they might see that they are not. And so to answer this question, it's really important for us to acknowledge and report on how these different management options affect these different services. And so if we need to account for all these natural disturbances in our answers, then we can't give this one size fit all answer to how we can manage different forest regions, because our forests are facing a very different suite of climatic disturbances. And so these maps here represent estimated forest carbon emissions from 3 very different types of disturbances. And the darker the green a county is in this map, the greater the estimated carbon loss to that disturbance over a 10-year period about a decade ago. And so we know that our western forests over here are burning and are now annual carbon sources. They are not sinks because of wildfires that are burning trees and soils. We know in the southeastern United States, we're losing a ton of carbon to hurricanes and other windstorms that are toppling trees and killing trees. And that here in the northeastern United States, so Connecticut right here, but in the Northeast writ large, that we have a very diverse and abundant selection of introduced pests and pathogens that are killing some of our most dominant trees in our forest and leading to more carbon emissions. So to really address this question that the DOA asked us, we had to consider the regional context of forest management for each region. And so should you venture to read our report, you'll see that we provide 3 very different options across the country for the DOE to consider. It could be fire resilient management treatments in these western dry forests. They could think about planting vast acres of pine plantations across the southeastern United States. Or they could promote sustainable silvicultural practices to private landowners to provide income, promote diverse tree regeneration, and also allow forests to continue capturing carbon. And while I wish I had enough time today to tell you about all 3 of these options, I'm just going to focus on talking about forest management for the forests that we have around here in Connecticut. But I just want to say that I believe you've already heard Dr. Yuen Yao talk about afforestation and reforestation of these pine plantations in a biome presentation last year, and I think they're all online. Yuen and Bing Chuan and the Industrial Ecology Lab here collaborated with us on the report, and they adapted some of their findings from a recent publication and proceedings of the National Academies of Sciences to go into this report. And Reed Lewis isn't here today, but I know he's watching online, so I'm putting him on the spot. Reed is a PhD student here at YSE. He led our project work on the fire resilient forest treatments. And so Reed, if you are listening, I really hope that you will be presenting this at a future research day or PhD dissertation defense in the future. Okay, so we're now narrowing our question to how we can manage southern New England forests to remove more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And this work was led by a postdoc here at YAS, Dr. Wei Liu. And so remember, lesson number 1 is that we need to include disturbances in any models or projections. And so there's a few that we need to include, which include windstorms, droughts, and pests and pathogens. And those are all critical disturbances in the forest here today. And so while windstorms and extreme weather are definitely a lot more severe in the southeastern United States, we actually do have our fair share of notable hurricanes, like the hurricane of 1938, and we can still see traces of this hurricane in the forests around Connecticut today. Or even a more recent hurricane, Hurricane Sandy, which brought down a ton of trees, and a fun fact, some skeletons on the New Haven Green when it passed through just a few years ago. We also have a lot of small microbursts and tornadoes here in our forests, like the 2018 tornado that popped up in Sleeping Giant State Park right here that took down about 2,000 trees within the park itself, but also another 1,500 trees. And so these windstorms are very present today in our forests and also projected to be more likely present in the future. We also have a range of forest pests and pathogens that increase tree mortality in our forest. And just these 4 agents that I'm highlighting here are all present in Connecticut and southern New England's forests today. They're all known to lead to really rapid tree death of very common dominant tree species in our forest. And so these are important disturbances that we also need to include in our models. And we also have right here, our second lesson is including these various diverse narratives or ideas of how we should be managing our forests. We have right here in southern New England a very contentious debate on how the state of Massachusetts should be managing its forest lands, pitting these sort of 2 distinct preservationist and conservationist viewpoints of forest management, where the state governor right now is questioning whether Massachusetts should ban all forest harvesting on state-owned forest lands, or if there are some more sustainable ways to harvest trees, provide rural economies money, and also wood resources for the state to use. And so in answering this question and encompassing all these different disturbances and narratives, we ran simulation models on how southern New England's forests might grow in response to these 3 different management options that I'll go over, and then these 3 potential disturbance outcomes and moving forward. We used really fine scale forest inventory data, which are all these little hatch dark brown and gray and black hatch marks over here, which came to us through the Massachusetts Department of Forestry and Conservation, the New York City Water Authority, as well as the U.S. Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis plots. And we actually are really proud that we were able to collect all of this data, because even though these are little tiny points on a map, it represents a lot more fine scale inventory than go into these carbon analyses usually. We use the U.S. Forest Service Forest Vegetation Simulator model, which is a really standard tool used by the Forest Service to project future forest conditions and tree growth, and frequently used in these types of carbon analyses. So we specifically explored these 3 different harvest options. The first was a no harvest option, which is in line with that preservation approach of forest management. We don't need to do anything, we're just going to let the trees grow. We also looked at 2 different harvest scenarios, which we can see on the landscape here in southern Connecticut. The first one, which we're calling exploitation harvest, is one that maximizes the present day value of a forest by removing all the high value trees above a certain size class. And this harvest is going to maximize wood products from the present day, but it's also going to result in the long term of a forest filled with smaller, denser trees and a more even sized distribution in the long run, also less wood products through time. We also had a harvest scenario that I'm going to call a sustainable harvest scenario, just so anyone, a forester here, Mark Ashton hates that I'm trying to distill these down to simple words. So I do have for my foresters the actual simulations that we have in there. But our second scenario is a sustainable harvesting scenario, which is a regeneration harvest. It's considered more sustainable. It's what folks do at the Yale Myers Forest in managing the forests of Yale. And the idea is that we can regenerate a wider diversity and a higher abundance of tree seedlings by leaving mature seed trees on the landscape and also actually creating larger canopy gaps to allow those seedlings to grow. For our 3 disturbance options, we simulated 100 years of forest growth in 3 different conditions. 1, no disturbance, right? This is a super optimistic view of what the future will look like under just regular tree mortality from growth. We have an extreme weather scenario that includes droughts about every 10 years. We've had a couple past summers of bad drought, so anyone who's been in Connecticut for us recently knows what that looks like. And we also simulated 1 major windstorm event that happened at year 10, but is like a once in a 50 year windstorm event. And then we had an extreme weather scenario coupled with those 4 pests and pathogens that I talked about earlier. And so here's what we found, and I'm going to walk you through these axes before starting to fill the panels with data. On this bottom axis, we have our years after cutting. So for our harvest scenarios, we simulated cutting at year 1 in our model. And on the left-hand side of the axis, we have the carbon density or the carbon storage, which is the tons of carbon per hectare in these various forest carbon pools. And to start filling this graph, I'm going to show you about the carbon stored in the forest carbon pools. And so these include sort of living tree carbon that's above ground, dead tree carbon in the forms of standing dead trees, trees that have fallen to the forest floor but haven't started to decompose, and then also living and dead tree roots within the forest. And these are the major carbon pools that people usually track in these analyses. And so what do we find? Okay. Well, first we find that in this optimistic no disturbance scenario, that in fact, letting trees grow may leave us with the densest carbon stocks. That's this panel right up here. We see all those trees growing and storing carbon in those healthy tree trunks and limbs. And we see right here our simulation that drop in carbon here and here. That's our harvest scenario. And we see this total dip in carbon stocks. And you can see the subsequent harvest events in this exploitation harvest period of these little peaks and valleys. But what we see is that as we go up, we only recapture about 71% of the total standing carbon relative to no harvest when we look at exploitation harvest, and we get about 92% of the total forest carbon after 100 years of sustainable harvest. And so if this is the scope of your evaluation, carbon stocks within the forest, and especially if you're looking at a shorter time span, then you now have a lot of evidence that actually this no harvest scenario, let's just let the trees grow, seems to be the best for carbon stocks and climate mitigation. But we have to question how realistic this scenario is. And it's a pretty rosy picture for the next 100 years. And we think it might be incomplete. And one thing I'll note is that we did actually do a synthesis of peer-reviewed studies that looked at projections for carbon stocks, especially in southern New England. And almost none of them included any major disturbances in their models. So it's a good thing to note that when you're looking at these studies, you do have to think about what are they modeling and what are their assumptions. We think that this might be pretty unlikely for our region moving forward. So now what happens when we simulate these extreme weather events in the forest? And so here's what you see. Here's our extreme weather. It's a drought coupled with a major windstorm. And you can see all of this living dark green stock goes into the darker green goes into this lighter green standing dead tree stock. So we see that initial pulse of tree mortality from those extreme weather events. And we see that that carbon is eventually going to fall to the forest floor, going into fallen dead trees, and then move into these other carbon pools as those trees decompose. You can see our punctuated droughts also in these punctuations of standing dead trees going. And in general, we see what we would expect to see. So our model seems to be doing what we want, which is that under these extreme, but also very likely weather conditions, forest stand could be a poor long-term reservoir for carbon storage. And so if you're someone with a really grim sense of the future, and this is the scope of your analysis, then you might say to me, see, I told you, forests are not our climate friends. They're going to make unreliable, non-permanent carbon storage facilities because look at all this carbon that we have lost from these disturbances. But what happens when we look at the interactions between disturbances and harvesting? We actually see a more hopeful picture. And so these red dashed lines here show the carbon stocks of the no harvest under extreme weather, and then the carbon pools recovering after these harvesting events. And what we see is that especially in our sustainable harvesting scenario after about 45 years, we actually have forest carbon levels recovering beyond what we saw in the no harvest scenario. And this is because in the no harvest scenario, all those small trees that were in our model that are in the forest inventory today, those are growing up and they're filling that space, but they're denser and they're not growing as big as these big canopy gaps that are filling with diverse and abundant tree seedlings that are then growing up post events to reclaim forest within this forest stand. And so finally, we can look at our extreme weather plus our pests and pathogens. And indeed, the story is a little bit scarier and not so good. These levels, again, are showing levels relative to no harvest and extreme weather. We see that we still have depleted carbon stocks, and that's in our beech and our ash trees and our oak trees going under that simulated mortality for those extra pests and pathogens. But we also still see that we're recovering more carbon in our forest under sustainable harvesting than either of our two scenarios. And so this narrative that forests are no longer our climate friends is partially true. So if we think our future is going to involve extreme disturbances, which I think is pretty likely for our forests here in New England, that our forests are likely going to store less carbon on the landscape than what they might do under no disturbance events. But what we can also see is that there's evidence that we can manage our forest in ways that can increase their resilience to these future disturbances. And so while this narrative is not wrong that forests are no longer our climate friends, I also think that it fails to see that we can actually potentially be friends to our forest by managing them in ways that can promote their resilience in the face of some of these extreme weather disturbances. So I'm now shown, and I know there's some architects and mass timber folks in the room, that there's this really strong interaction between projections of the impacts of forest management and future disturbances. But this is only right now accounting for the carbon that's in the forest itself. And so, of course, we're missing two key carbon pools, which is all that harvested wood that came out of the forest in our two harvest scenarios. And those wood products are also storing carbon as long as those wood products are not decomposing or thrown away. And so here's our same figure, but now I'm adding two more carbon pools, our wood products that are either in use in orange or in the landfill in blue. And we can see that if we expand our carbon accounting boundary to include this out of the forest carbon, that after 100 years, the sustainable harvest becomes, in the no disturbance scenario, actually recovers 99% of the carbon relative to the no harvest scenario. And we also then see bigger protection of these forest carbon stocks in these disturbance events, because of course we've pulled that wood out of the forest and we've put it somewhere where it's potentially more safely stored from these extreme weather events. So there we go. And so now I've given you a lot of different ways that the future of the forest in southern New England could look, a lot of different projections. And so to come back to the question that the DOE asked us, how can the US manage forests to remove more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? We can see that the answer is really highly contingent upon your assumptions about what you think the future is going to look like, and also contingent upon what you think about the different forests, where carbon should be, whether it's on the land or in wood products, in both. And so this heat map shows that on shorter time frames, here, 25 years, these rows, this is our extreme weather, and this is our extreme weather pests and diseases, that we're always losing carbon on the landscape, but we're losing more carbon. Sorry, this is all relative. These heat maps are relative to no harvest for our 2 harvest scenarios. So we're always losing carbon when we're harvesting in the short time frame of our analysis. But that as we look to longer time frames, and especially as we look to scenarios where we're expecting to see more climate-related disturbances, we actually see that we can store carbon both in the land and off the land through some of these sustainable management practices. But I'm going to leave you with these 9 panels because we gave the DOE one answer, but these all represent future projections of what the world could look like. And so I like showing this because I really think it helps show how we can reconcile all these different narratives that we have about managing carbon by really saying, well, what are we talking about? Are we talking about the same time span? Are we talking about the same carbon pools? Are we talking about the same assumptions about what we think the world is going to look like in the future? All right. So now I've just told you that in deciding what we do with our managed lands requires us to make some guesses about what we think the future is going to look like. And so it follows, and it makes a lot of sense that the next reasonable question that people would ask because of this imperfect information is, well, once I make a management decision, can I tell if what I'm doing is actually working? And so for the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk about a project that we're working on that falls into this bin of how can we tell what we're doing is working. And this was a question posed to us by the Environmental Defense Fund that's interested in knowing specifically about how soil carbon crediting methodologies, how well they're doing at delivering equivalent carbon credits. And this question by the EDF and this use of carbon credits in the soil carbon space is really underpinned by the fact that globally, humans have converted natural ecosystems to croplands and grazing lands, and this has led to massive losses of soil carbon across these ecosystems. And the total estimated amount is about 133 petagrams or gigatons of carbon, or 488 petagrams or gigatons of carbon dioxide. And this map here shows that right here, this is sort of the heartland of the Midwestern United States, all these red and orange pixels, that in the Midwestern of the United States, which is our dominant corn and soy croplands, they've lost substantial amounts of carbon since the conversion from native prairie ecosystems to croplands. And some of the most damaging practices to soil carbon stocks that we have in this area are annual tillage events of soils, which reduce weeds, help it easier to plant seeds each year, and also leaving the fields barren between cash crop planting. And so both of these practices, we have a lot of evidence that reducing or stopping tillage events, which is also called conservation tillage, or I'll call it no tillage in this talk, or adding cover crops so we keep erosion from moving soil and losing carbon during the non-growing season of the cash crops, can improve soil health and potentially increase soil organic carbon stocks. And with the uptake and interest in carbon capture and storage and natural systems writ large, there's really widespread interest now in using voluntary carbon credit markets and programs to stimulate the uptake of these practices. And so what the Environmental Defense Fund really wants to know is to make sure that these carbon crediting methodologies, which are also known as protocols, are delivering consistent and equivalent carbon credits. And so to answer this question for them, we took 3 of the major protocols written by the Climate Action Reserve, Verra, and NORI, and we conducted what we're calling a benchmarking exercise. And specifically what we wanted to know is that if we start with the same suite of farmland field data, and we use each of the different protocols written by these different registries, how many credits do we get out on the other end? And I'll just say this project has been led by Dr. Lisa Ish, another postdoc at YASP, and of course working with our own in-house soil carbon guru, Mark Bradford. And so to start this project, we first had to find this common data set of corn and soy fields to measure. And this data set needed to include things like field locations, crop and management history, different soil conditions like pH and bulk density and texture. And we had really high hopes at the beginning of this project that we could actually use real data collected on real farms, also through time in response to these management treatments, to form the backbone of this data analysis. But we found that both privacy and proprietary data concerns meant that we would have to create our own simulated data set. There was no data available that we could use that was accessible to us to use for answering this question. And this was a really huge challenge. And so this is a single slide showing all the different publicly available data sources that we pulled together to get all these different data layers to put together this one clean data, spatially explicit data layer containing all the information we needed to answer this project. What we have here that Lisa put together was a subset of about 5,000 fields, which represents about 1% of the cropland in each of the counties in each of these 6 Midwestern states. And after we compiled our data set, we needed to map the variation and how these carbon crediting methodologies actually calculated their carbon credits. And so we divided the flow of credit estimation into these 4 different bins. We looked at the additionality rules, which determined eligibility of farm fields to enroll in the programs. We looked at how those protocols, what models and what measurements they used to actually estimate carbon storage gains. We then looked at how the protocols dealt with uncertainty, and then how they dealt with something called reversals, which would be an unintentional loss of carbon in the ecosystem due to some unforeseen event. Oh, this is where I have to click here. Perfect. And so here's what we found. One of the first major areas of divergence was how protocols assess this thing called additionality. And additionality is a really important criteria in voluntary carbon markets that ensures that if you are buying a carbon credit, that the only reason that that person, or that grower in this case, has implemented the practice is because you have paid them to do so. And so in other words, we don't want to pay people to do something that they were already going to do. And so we found that protocols varied in their application of this really specific type of additionality test called the common practice test. And the common practice test assumes that if an agricultural practice is common within a growing region, or it's widely adopted, a lot of people are using it, then growers are going to be likely to adopt that practice whether or not you pay them. And so in other words, we don't want to pay people who are going to adopt a practice anyways. We only want to pay people who are not going to adopt the practice. And this common practice test is a means for the protocols to be able to assess whether or not something is common practice within the region. And so what we found, I'll just point out here first, is we had wide variation from NORI, which had no common practice test, to Vera and CAR, Climate Action Reserve, that had very different sort of threshold levels for what they considered common practice. And so what this meant, sorry, I don't know why this does this. Okay, so what this meant is when we looked at our 5,000 field data set and we applied these common practice and the other additionality rules, we actually found 100% difference in just eligible fields, where NORI, this is for just the adoption of no-till agriculture, NORI had about 3,000 fields that were eligible based on their protocol. But if we looked down at Vera, which was sort of across the board our most conservative protocol that we assessed, 0 of the fields met that common practice test. So all of a sudden, we have this huge range in additionality, leading us to question, what is additional? We're not sure, but the protocols aren't necessarily giving a consistent answer. But here's what we found that was really wild, is that these protocols allow for something called practice stacking. And that means a grower could adopt more than one practice. So they could just adopt conservation tillage or no-till, or they could adopt no-till plus cover cropping. And these practice stacking rules allow for crediting for a common practice, like let's say conservation tillage, to be credited along with an uncommon practice like cover cropping. And so when we applied the common practice rules for this practice stacking, we saw that all the differences between our protocols actually disappeared, and that almost all 5,000 fields were eligible. And this is because cover cropping is a very uncommon practice in general. And because cover cropping was so uncommon that all of these fields that were excluded for single practice now all of a sudden become eligible to enroll, and it wiped out any differences in additionality. So again, I think it leads to a lot of questions about what these additionality tests are doing and which of these fields or which of these practices are actually providing additional carbon benefits, versus which ones are not real and additional. And so while protocols differed in how they assess additionality, they're actually very, very similar in how they modeled and measured soil carbon gains. And they all relied on these process-based biogeochemical models that are all built to simulate soil carbon gains through time. And there's a handful of different models and many, many, many different versions of models that could be applied under these different, or especially under CAR and Vera, under these different protocols. What we decided to do was standardize our approach and only use the same version of a model called DACENT. And we used sampling data and that version of DACENT that were used for the 2019 US greenhouse gas inventory. So we felt like that was a pretty good model to base our analysis on. And so while we standardized our modeling approach, we used the exact same model across all three. I just want to point out that for these two, for CAR and Vera, there's a lot of different versions and a lot of different models that in theory could be applicable, meaning that we could have a lot of differences between these protocols and the number of credits that they generate from this modeling, which we're just not testing here. But after the modeling and measurement, we also found a lot of deviations and a lot of other major assessment. One was the greenhouse gas boundaries for each of these protocols. So we found that NORI only looked at carbon, whereas CAR and Vera looked at other greenhouse gases. We found that there were variations in how these protocols dealt with uncertainty, and then also how these protocols dealt with reversals by putting credits into what's called a buffer pool, which is in case you lose soil carbon, you have reserve credits that you can pull out of the buffer pool. From NORI, again, the most liberal of the protocols that has no buffer contribution, to different rules of what buffer contributions go in. And so, okay, taken together, I'm now going to walk you through what we found and how these differences in protocols leads to different carbon credit calculations. And I'll walk you through this graph again, where on this bottom x-axis, we have our three different carbon protocols down here. And on our y-axis, we have the number of carbon credits and tons of carbon per year that we think would be issued following these different protocols. This top row is going to show credits for just the adoption of a single practice, no-till. And this bottom row is going to show for the adoption of no-till plus cover cropping, that's stacked practice adoption. And so first, if we just look at carbon credits that are issued for carbon itself, just for the soil organic carbon pools, here's what we see. And sorry, I'm going to point out here too, the stacked bar graphs have three colors. The dark blue is the actual number of issued credits that we think would be issued by a protocol. The green is that buffer pool, so the set-aside credits in case of reversals. And then the gray is the number of credits that aren't actually issued because of uncertainty deductions. And so what we can start to see here is we do get more credits issued with our practice stacking than with our no-till agriculture. But you can also see a really clear difference. If you remember, this is Vera right here. Vera said no fields in the data set were eligible for single practice adoption. So they're actually awarding 0 credits for a single practice, but many more credits. You also can see here that Vera had a much more stringent uncertainty deduction than these other two protocols. Okay. Next, remember that some of these protocols, Vera and CAR, had other additional greenhouse gases that they include in their assessment boundary. And one of the major gases is nitrous oxide, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. It's a very prevalent climate pollutant in a lot of agricultural ecosystems. It is also super hard to measure and monitor, and these models don't do a really great job. And they actually do such a not great job that we see that CAR allowed for the issuance of some extra credits for nitrous oxide with a pretty large, almost 50% uncertainty deduction. But Vera, with that really stringent uncertainty deduction, basically said the models are not good enough. We're not going to issue any nitrous oxide credits. And so finally, when we take it all together and we look at all the greenhouse gases, We now are just showing the issued credits that we estimated from each of the protocols, and we can see these really wide variations. So first, the most interesting thing is that NORI and Climate Action Reserve are actually issuing very similar amounts of credits. But you have to remember that the way they got to these credits was totally different. NORI is only selling you soil carbon credits, and they have no buffer pool. So if there's a reversal, there's no extra credits there. Whereas CAR has a small buffer pool and is also selling you some of these uncertain but nitrous oxide credits. We also see that Vera's additionality rules have reduced, 100% less credits, again, in the single practice adoption, but also are issuing about 60% fewer credits than these other two protocols. And so coming back to this original question of, are these protocols delivering equivalent carbon credits? I think the answer is pretty much no, but it raises a lot of really important follow-up questions. And here are a few that I think. The first is, well, what's the impact of this initial data and model structure? So we constrained that variation in our analysis by using a single model variant and single sampling data to calibrate and validate that model. But that is something that could definitely be tested moving forward, of how these different rules in modeling could change credits. There's also an important question about, well, what credits are actually additional? I don't think the current additionality rules are doing a great job at determining what's additional and what's not in these credits. We found that growers might be eligible to enroll in some programs, but not others. And then if growers were willing to adopt an uncommon practice, they could receive credits for a practice that was very common in their region. I think there's also a lot of questions about whether we can reliably credit for nitrous oxide, and whether then that is like a specific modeling and actually something the EDF is looking at right now. And then the last is how we should be dealing with uncertainty in the models. We saw really wide variation in the uncertainty deductions, and all of that has to do with underlying philosophy of the people writing these protocols about how much uncertainty they want to account for in their crediting and how conservative they want to be. I also don't really want you to walk away from this thinking that you know the right amount of credits that should be issued. This, of course, the data set we used was simulated, so it's not real. It was sort of a mashup of a bunch of spatially publicly available data. But we actually don't know, because this is all just modeling, of what the accurate amount of credits that are real and additional and certain and that have a buffer pool. And so again, this comes down to that your judgment of the quality of these credits is going to have to do with more about your philosophy and tolerance for additionality and loss of additionality or uncertainty, or how much you want extra buffer pools in it, than actually the knowable, the truth of how much soil carbon is being stored by these adoption and practice changes. And so with that, thank you for listening to me share a little bit about what we've been working on for the past 2 years. I really hope this gives you a flavor about how we help people make decisions about land management in complex worlds. I really like to unpack the reasons why people might come to different conclusions about the best management practices or the best methodologies, and really pointing out that it has to do with different assumptions about what the future may hold and different, philosophies of what we want to see in terms of our land management. And I'll just end again, so since Liza put this plug in, that I have really enjoyed getting to know a lot of the fantastic folks here. And so if you're a student, you don't need to be a forester, you don't need to be a farmer to come work with us. And I really do actually encourage you to come chat with me after the talk, or come find me or find me up at Marshall or email me with my email address here. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
I have time for questions.
Thanks, Sarah. Great talk. I had a question about the timing of the disturbance in the forest model. So if you're just simulating that storm hitting at 10 years, how sensitive are the results to if it happened in year 1 or if it doesn't happen till year 30? And then what is that based on, and how realistic is that in terms of future predictions for those kinds of events?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and one that also folks from the U.S. Forest Service asked Ware when he went and presented to a bunch of them. And the answer is it definitely event. So Liza was asking about, we simulated harvest at year 1 in those forest analyses, and then we had to force the model into a disturbance scenario at whatever year we chose. And so definitely some of those gains were that we removed the standing carbon from the forest and moved it into wood products. We regenerated a whole bunch of seedlings that were resilient to the disturbance, and they grew up into that gap. And so I wish I had done this, because I knew this question was going to come up, of Ware did do some sensitivity analysis where he looked at different timings of the harvest to the disturbance, and the answer changed, but not that much, right? This is what we say to reviewers. As long as the disturbance happens after the harvest. If the disturbance happened before the harvest, that picture would change a lot. But the other thing that I didn't show here, and that we did have to do for the roads for removal report, is this is basically an analysis averaging across all those forest inventory stands, so we can sort of think of it as a single forest stand. And the forest vegetation simulator is not a spatial model, so it can't tell us across the landscape. So we sort of had to do some janky stuff to turn it into a spatial estimate. But imagine if you cut, let's say 2%, which is sort of the working average that a lot of foresters use. You cut 2% of your forest land in any given year, and then you had that mosaic of forests of different age classes on the landscape. Some are going to get hammered, but some are going to be more resilient. And so the actual prescription across the landscape looks like don't harvest everything at once and don't not harvest anything, but give that fluctuation across the landscape where you hopefully do hit it at good times versus bad.
Hey, actually, I wanted to follow up on that. What about frequency of the extreme weather events, and then how might that impact the more resilient vegetation?
Yeah, so the way this modeling structure works with the vegetation simulator is we basically can toggle mortality of individual tree species, or tree species by size. And so we used estimates from the literature and sort of working knowledge of all the very smart foresters that we have here to say, what does drought mortality look like? How much does oak mortality or birch mortality increase with about 10-year severe periodic droughts? And so if you made that more extreme in our modeling, then we would have more, closer together mortality of these sort of larger trees. Whether that, adequately captures what would happen with 3 years of drought. So from 2016 to 2018, we had some really major late season droughts here, coupled with the spongy moth infestations. And so our trees were getting hammered. They were getting defoliated once or twice, and they were dealing with droughts. And so we saw this big peak in mortality after a couple years of those forest stands that got hit with both of those together. Whereas other stands that maybe weren't as droughty or didn't have as extreme of a spongy moth infestation, the mortality went down. So the answer is it definitely would change. And if you had more severe events that led to more mortality, then we would see the shrinking of that dark green carbon pool and the increase of either the wood product pool if you pulled the wood off the land or into those other carbon pools. But how it actually plays out would probably be quite different. And so really important to these are sort of projections and sort of the far ends of how the world could work, as opposed to sort of the actual standing stocks that we might see in any one place in time.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi,
Thanks
Vincent.
for the presentation. Yeah. I wanted to ask you if the model, the climatic model you used to determine disturbances, pests, and droughts, if that was spatial, if that was applied to the whole forest, or it was applied to areas where you thought that would happen, or a proportion of it. Because I imagine, because that modeling shows what happens if all the forest gets hit, but I'm assuming that is not always the case. And how much uncertainty do those models have?
Yeah. So the forest vegetation simulator model that we used here was not a spatially explicit model. So basically what I was showing was an average of carbons. Imagine that event happened to all, I can't remember now how many forest inventory points we had, but everything happened at the same time to all those inventory points. What's the average across all those stands, which varied in their composition and their age class and, everything. So it wasn't spatially explicit that this patch. And so that sort of goes back to what I was saying to Liza is there are spatially explicit models. They have a whole different suite of assumptions where you could toggle that higher probability of certain extreme events in some areas spatially versus others. But that is not this model. And so this really is just imagine a forest stand and what could happen on these like projection scenarios.
Thank you. I have a related question. So the model includes different species, right?
Mm-hmm.
And does the management then affect the diversity of the forest, and does that affect the impact of pests?
Oh, that's a really good question. The answer to that is yes, and I opted not to show some of those diversity and composition figures in lieu of time, but would be happy to share them with you at any point. So we do see shifts in composition, both from extreme weather and pest and pathogen events, because those pests and pathogens, some of them are very species specific, and so those, you know, are beech trees and our ash trees are basically falling out of the forest, which is what we are seeing or may see in the future. And then the regeneration, we do get a pulse of more diverse in the sustainable harvest, which is what you see when you open up the canopy. Those do persist and change the composition. I think the answer is tree diversity doesn't change across all three, but you get a different composition and you get different evenness of species within the forest. But the diversity metrics, I think the exploitation harvest was the worst, and the disturbance events reduced diversity because of the excess tree mortality. But you see similar species richness, different compositions across those treatments.
Thank you.
So thank you everybody for coming. Can we give Dr. Kuebbing another round of applause?
Sure.
Lots of fun.